Hi, my name is Vijay Kumar. I'm the author of The Idle Thief. I thank the organizers of the Pondy Lit Fest for giving me this opportunity to discuss this book and the wonderful journey that has led me on for the last decade and a half that eventually culminated in this book, and also quite a few eventful, interesting data that helped me write this book. So basically, I never wanted to be a writer. I had been my interest in Indian art, especially Indian temple art and iconography. I'm largely self-taught, led me on a journey of self-discovery. So I was basically documenting my learning process with just a small circle of friends in groups before we evolved into a larger platform of blogging. And I'd like to thank my core team of people who supported me during my blogging days. Well, then I was still not looking at writing a book. But then events conspired, and I would say destiny intervened, and The Idle Thief happened. Uh, the Idle Thief is actually a non-fiction. It's an account of how we nabbed one of India's largest idol smugglers and also exposed the dark underbelly of the art market. The art market has so far not been of interest to anybody in India. Hardly any books have been written on art, especially ancient art. And when we talk about ancient art, a bulk of the stuff that's been smuggled and written about in this book is over 1,000 years old. And all these are efforts of our ancestors who poured their blood, sweat, and toil to create these magnificent masterpieces of art, edifices that have stood the test of time for 1,000 years. Often, ravages of time and invaders had an effect, but then some of them, especially the core incidents of this book, inspired a lot of good people to do good work in protecting not just art, because they never looked at it as art. They looked at them as gods. And this book is about how our gods are being commercialized, and commercialized to the extent that our gods are being openly auctioned for millions of dollars. Literally, some of the art pieces that we have restituted back, meaning gotten back, these gods were eventually bought by museums for over 40 crore rupees each of them. The culmination of this book resulted in a court case filing in New York that led to a seizure over a 4-year period from 2012 to 2016 of an operation called the Operation Hidden Idol by US Homeland Security that yielded 2,622 objects valued at $108 million. And this was the holding stock of the villain of my book. I want to call him the hero, Subhash Kapoor. But before we get into the details of the chase, as how I documented in the book, I'd like to place my thanks to my good friend, Mr. Jason Felch, Pulitzer shortlisted journalist who had been covering the art market. In fact, one of his books by the same name, called Chasing Aphrodite, was like my guidebook, and I had worked and collaborated with Jason on this journey. When my publishers, and I would say that Juggernaut is one of those truly enterprising publishing houses, reached out to Jason sometime in 2015, asking for somebody to author a book on art crime, especially the Kapoor case. Jason went back to them and said, if there's one person who can write a book on Kapoor, it has to be Vijay. So things fell in place, and this is a commissioned book by Juggernaut. So I thank Juggernaut and also my editor, Mr. Parth, as well as those who translated it, Mr. Mia Bahadevan, who did it in Tamil, and Mr. Badri Shadri of New Horizon Media, Kerkapadikam, who has brought it out in Tamil, and also Manjul Publications, who have since translated and brought it out into Marathi, Malayalam and Hindi versions are en route as well. There is some more good news that's to come on this book, which we hope to break soon. Why the book? Why would somebody want to write a book for somebody who never wanted to write a book? Well, for me, the rampant looting of Indian artifacts, our gods, the systematic plunder on an industrial scale had for long gone unnoticed. There have been massive cover-ups, and this book is a result of wanting to stop one more such cover up. We have lost artifacts by the thousands, and I'm not fudging this number. And India's record at bringing back antiquities is been dismal. To quote the CAG report of 2013, lists just 19 artifacts from 1970 to 2012, wherein there are documented records. Every decade, we've had big photo op seizures, big names, but then eventually they would go scot free because of want of evidence. And this evidence is what we provided, and that's what me and my team provided. There's been a lot of arguments, counter arguments on a work of fiction, a non-fiction having a very, very unique starting chapter. The starting chapter actually talks about buried hoards, buried bronzes. When you talk about bronzes, I'm talking about very special, high water mark of Indian art, the Chola bronzes. These Chola bronzes, as we now call them, are called as Thirumenis back home. Tirumeni in Tamil literally translates to body of God. So these bronzes were worshipped as living gods in their abodes, the temples. So the priests would wake them up by singing songs. They would be bathed, they'll be dried, they'll be clothed, they'll be fed, they'll be sung songs. They would have festivals like marriages, and in the night they would be sung to and put to sleep in their own bedrooms. So that's how they lived their lives as living gods for thousands of years. The Chola period, which we're talking about, at least the high water mark, is from the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries. That's when the art of bronze casting reached its pinnacle. And it's been the target of smugglers right from the 1950s. We have lost thousands of such bronzes. Many times fakes have replaced the originals, and we exposed one such in this book. But above all, in the 14th century, when there was a massive invasion into South India, these bronzes were melted, and sometimes the stone idols were broken. To safeguard them, the custodians went through the agamic process. The text, the core text basically mentioned how to safeguard bronzes and the other movable deities. They basically say that you have to dig a pit, line it with charcoal, grass, and then the Thirumenis were kept face down, and then they were buried for safety. And after the threat passed away, they were supposed to be brought back, and then they would come back to worship. But for some reason, which is still speculated, a lot of these bronzes were not brought back. And to this day, every year we get at least 6 or 7 such buried hoards finds are across South India. Now, the only guess that I could fathom was that either the custodians were driven away so far that the threat, because it was only for a couple of months, 6 months at the max that the threat was in, but then they could have easily come back and retrieved the bronzes. But then the entire memory of this burial was lost to the common public even. The only reason being the custodians gave up their life to support, to conceal their gods. And they did their supreme sacrifice to protect their gods. And then to see them dug up and sold against the laws for dollar-driven greed of the art market is something that I just could not come to. And this was happening to me, visible to me, being an amateur. Then definitely the experts and the custodians would have known, know, and will know. And for some reason, nobody wrote about it, nobody called these out, and nobody took any steps to get back even one of these stolen gods. Now, to start with, yes, we did know that, right from the 1960s and 70s, we have seen movies where the robbers take away gods. But what's happened to India? Why is it that we have continued to be plundered? It's because of this grey market, the art market. Now, to document all this in a book format was a challenge, because we were talking about a live case of a person who was arrested by an Interpol Red Corner notice in September 2011, extradited from Germany, into India in 2012, and the trial still in 2020 is still ongoing. And to come out with a non-fiction on an active case is really tough. And that's where credit to my publishers and my editor and our legal team who stood by me to go through the book. So yeah, so now you have the basic ingredients for a book. You got a criminal, a large number of guards that have been smuggled, and then you have a live case, and you've got law enforcement and whatnot. So it was really tough to get this into something that was publishable. So that's where I think my brief and my editor's brief was very clear. We wanted to have a book that was not too big on technicalities. It didn't have too many technical words. It had to appeal to the common man, because our idea was to make it an awareness book. We wanted to get people to know about the rampant robbing of Indian temples. So how do we get it out at the same time balancing the legal aspects? So we decided that it will be properly annotated. It'll have all the references. If people wanted to read more, they would. But the brief was very simple: 3 hours from start to finish. So we wanted to keep the book very simple, and we also wanted it to be engaging. So every chapter we wanted it to look like a series. So it should be unputdownable, because quite often books on Indian art, history, or even worship tend to be looked at in a kind of negative way by the young audience. We wanted to do away with it. But having said that, I would say that writing a book is really tough. And for me, blogging is very easy. You just put interesting visuals, interesting pictures, and the first thing that you realize when you are writing a book is that pictures cost money. So you need to restrict the number of pictures and sketches and maps. The content is king. So we realize we have to put more emphasis on the content and in terms of characterizations. So the key character in this book, of course, the real hero is Indy. Of course, we can't name him right now. He is somebody who's been a pillar of support. And if at all India has to thank somebody for this major seizure, it's full credit to Indy. I'd also like to thank a few other people who stood along with me on this journey in terms of support. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who's been a pillar of support. He was the one who launched the book in Delhi. He's been watching my journey over the last almost 6 years. And next would be Amish. Of course, everybody knows Amish. So when we reached out to Amish saying we're coming out with this book, he readily agreed to write a blurb for it. And of course, Mr. Hussain Zaidi. So imagine a first-time published writer, and his book is endorsed by Sanjeev Sanyal, Amish, and Hussain Zaidi. So it was really thanks to Jagannath who managed to get all three of them. And of course, I was privileged to have Dr. Meenakshi Jain for the launch as well. And in fact, in her book, she actually credits our work. For all people who are asking about what's happened on the follow-up of this case, yes, our team, we call it the India Pride Project. I've been doing this work since 2006. The actual name we came up in 2014 to formalize a kind of core team of volunteers who've been with us for a long time. I'm the face of this project. India Pride Project, we called it the India Pride Project because we felt we are restoring India's pride one murti at a time. So post this publication, from the time we started getting the necessary support from India and from overseas law enforcement, we have physically managed to bring back 53 and another 168 have been promised from the US, and quite a lot more are coming and en route on the way. So yes, there is a lot of things that we had not completed in the book. So definitely there have been follow-ups. So it's not a flash in the pan book. It's a work in progress. It's been an interesting journey. I would say that writing a book definitely places you in a different frame of mind and also in a different league. For a long time, I was hesitant to write a book because I said, yeah, I've seen books written by great scholars. I'm not talking about fiction or non-fiction, talking about books on art and iconography, which are written like PhD theses, which people generally don't even have time to go through the third page. It largely sit in libraries. But then this non-fiction genre, I think, is definitely something that is very, very useful, especially when you're talking about exposes. I think more such publishers should come up to talk about many contemporary crimes. And of course, the subject experts should be encouraged to document their process to inspire more people to take it up and also to spread awareness. And I would say that Idle Thief has generally kind of woken up people from their slumber. They realize that this is a real and present danger that's robbing centuries worth of art and art material from our shores that are leaving by droves. What's happening is the dollar driven greed is funding illicit trafficking of antiquities. Trafficking of antiquities basically reduces historically significant objects. We're not talking about murtis now. We are talking about hero stones, we're talking about sati stones, we're talking about pottery, we're talking about coins, numismatics, name it. So all these are being illicitly removed from India. And once they are removed, they are reduced to being showpiece curios. You cannot basically, the historical context is lost. An archaeological person, an archaeologist digging, gives an object context. So maybe he will look at the strata, he'll look at the pottery, but a digger who's digging for immediate returns, an illicit digger, is going to look at objects that he can sell. So he will not reveal the dig site. One such terrible loss that we would like to document and which we have documented is the plunder of Chandraketuga. It's a site in West Bengal wherein Subhash Kapoor and his gang used to receive terracotta and stonework objects via flat packs, basically meaning courier parcels. And you can imagine terracotta objects, and these are not 100, 200 year old. We are talking about 2200, 2000 year old objects from the second century BC that have been couriered out. 90% arrived in the US broken, and then they were tried to be salvaged. Some of them were put together, some of them thrown off, and then they are sold in the art market. And every museum, every art dealer has objects from Chandraketuga. And Chandraketuga was a site that was excavated only in 1968. And why this 1968 is important is because in 1970, India and Italy championed the UN to come up with an international convention. Every country has its own patrimony laws. India has its patrimony laws from 1878. We have the Treasure Trove Act onwards. But then there was no unifying global act or a convention. That's when the UN kicked in, and they brought in the UN 1970 statute that at least after 1970 you can actually use the statute to ease restitutions. India has not, unfortunately, followed up on the statute's recommendations. Yeah, we did have our Antiquity Act that was constituted in 1972. It made into Parliament in 1977. But then there are a lot more things that needed to be done as part of our signing the 1970 convention, which included development of a national archive, development of a theft loss database, education, awareness, everything. Nothing has been done. And it's one of the main reasons why we are not able to bring back stolen objects by the thousands, because we need to show proof of theft. So what do we aim from the book or from a project? For us, every time a murti is returned, a historically significant artifact is returned, in our terms, it is restitution. It's not a gift. So next time somebody says the German president or prime minister gifted to our prime minister, it's wrong. You can gift what you own. You can't gift a stolen object. Restitution means returning what is lawfully yours. Having said that, we would like all of them to go back to the temples, and we have managed. Recently, we had the case of the famed Anandamangalam Rama group, the Rama, Lakshmana and Sita, who were stolen in 1978. They were found with a dealer in London, We managed to do the identification, and thanks to some amazing work by the High Commission officials in London, especially Mr. Rahul Nangre, the Idle Wing in Chennai, Mr. Abhay Singh, we managed to open the old case. It was closed as untraceable. About 2 or 3 people were arrested that time in 1978, but then the case was closed that it was untraceable. We managed to find it, and we managed to provide the proof. And here we need to salute the work of the French Institute in Pondicherry. Most of the work that you see in the book is actually thanks to pioneering work done by the French Institute in Pondicherry in the 1950s and 1960s, where they documented not much. They did about 6 to 8% of Tamil Nadu's temples, but their archive and their photo capturing detail was so brilliant that we have been able to use their images as in situ photographs for evidence. But what is interesting is not just that. It's not just the IFP's photos that have helped us. Thanks to Jason, we managed to understand that similar to the art market, these robbers across the world seem to use the same modus operandi. For example, the Italians basically had Polaroid photographs. As they're digging in graves, they come across these cups which are sold for millions. So the robbers, for proof that it's genuine, used to take Polaroid images. And these were actually put up to the prospective buyers as proof that they were actually dug from the ground. The Indian robbers, similarly, are taking robber photos. And as prospective grooms, they are being sending out to prospective buyers on social media apps, wherein people are bidding for our gods and then they are sold. So we managed to have access to one of such dossiers. We call it the robber photos. And it's really, really, really serious. You look at it, you know the extent of the theft. You have freshly removed huge door guardians, especially these two door guardians that come to my memory. They were kept in a farm, and the robbers basically hold a dhoti behind it for background. And then these photographs were sent out, and they were, of course, bought by Subhash Kapoor and later sold to the National Gallery of Australia. Now, with these robber photos, we can do more. But what is interesting is there was another photograph. We were actually tracking. Okay, the main artifact that we're talking about in this book is this beautiful, brilliant Nataraja that was stolen from the Sri Purandan temple in 2005. And what was interesting is the then curator of the National Gallery of Australia said there are hundreds of Natarajas. Everybody looks the same. You guys don't know the job. Well, what we did, we managed to have one of our friends go down to the National Gallery, take a high resolution photograph, and thanks to the IFP's archives, we managed to match these two images. And what is special about these bronzes, especially Chola bronzes, they're made by the lost wax method. Lost wax method is very simple. The entire image is cast in wax, and then they're coated in clay, hardened, and then the entire set is heated. The wax melts out, leaving a hollow core into which the metal is poured. Because what is interesting is once the metal cools down and hardens, you need to break the cast. The same cast cannot be reused. Like fake Chinese toys, you can't make 100 toys from the same mold. So each one of these Chola bronzes are uniquely handmade. So obviously they have small imperfections, small dimension changes, and over thousands of years of worship, small nicks, cuts, and bruises. And it was all these nicks, cuts, and bruises that helped us, not only in the Sri Purandan case, in the Nataraja's case, the Sri Purandan Uma's case, as well as the Toledo Ganesha's case. But sadly, what happened was this book has managed to also name a few of our own law enforcement who have been hand in glove with the idol smugglers. And not only that, when Kapoor was arrested in Germany via Red Corner notice, in fact, he was blissfully unaware that he was under police surveillance. He was actually in an art fair in Stuttgart trying to sell stolen artifacts when he was arrested in the airport. Under Interpol custody, he managed to smuggle out handwritten notes. And one of its notes, which now, thanks to the US court filing, we have access to, reads, "Hide the two dancers and consorts in my closet." And this was a note that he smuggled to his gallery manager, who eventually smuggled these two dancers, Natarajas, and consorts, Parvati, together valued at $13.5 million, to his sister, who has hidden them in New York since 2012. we have not been able to find these four bronzes, even though they have been documented. She has been charged in US court, she's out on bail. Well, is Kapoor the only smuggler? No. Kapoor was a medium-sized smuggler, but he was in business for 35 years in 2012. Our work basically has managed to expose three other dealers. One of them resulted in 50 antiquities being restituted to Pakistan last week. So yes, there is a lot of stuff that is being robbed from us source nations. Not only that, recently the FinCEN reports names that money laundering is also top priority and artifacts are used to launder money. Thanks to the Panama Papers, these networks, smuggling networks, don't want to keep the money in banks. They keep it in safe deposit as artifacts. So there's no trace. You can pay $1 million via artifacts, moving it within pre-ports. No traces, no exposes. So yes, our smugglers are using Hawala. Our smugglers are using a lot of money laundering tools. Plus, all this money is also used for aiding and abetting terrorism. The US has taken a very strong stance since they came to the notice in 2011. EU is up and strengthening their laws as well. They plan to use the tax evasion angle, and they're bringing in stricter laws to enforce to curb the illicit trafficking of cultural property. Sadly, India, the art market lobby cabal, has been assisted by a lot of celebrated scholars. We do know that our artifacts are being evaluated, authenticated, catalogs written by celebrated scholars. When we say celebrated scholars, we're talking about a few Lotus awardees as well, who have aided and assisted somebody like even Subhash Kapoor. Now, what happens when we rely on these grey historians and scholars? They tend to align public policy. One such is the current attempt to dilute the Antiquities Act, which we are fighting. The Antiquities Act, as I mentioned, was passed after a prolonged fight in the UN and the UN Statute, and part of our obligation to fulfill the UN Statute, the Antiquities Act was passed. Now, the Antiquities Act is very clear. If you have anything over 100 years old in your house, and if it's legally yours, that means you have clear title, you basically have to take it to the nearby ASI registered office, show it and get it registered. Once it's registered, it becomes unsellable outside India. That means it cannot be exported, but it can be freely sold within India via an authorized dealer, and he has to maintain stocks. So he has to have monthly stocks. Now, the art market is objecting to this simple requirement of having to register handicrafts and also to have an authorized dealer. Now, imagine you're buying a bike, you're buying a car, you go to an authorized dealer, and the authorized dealer will have monthly sales figures, he'll be paying sales tax. Now, in the art market, they don't want to do that. Further, they don't want to have a gatekeeper. They don't want the ASI to basically even check. So if you look at the Antiquities Act, the ASI officer has to conduct an inquiry and ask you basically how you got this, to rule out the possibility that you just picked it up off the road somewhere in a ruin. So there is a responsible government officer who basically checks it. In the new proposed amendments articulated by the Antiquities, the dark side of this art market cabal, they would want a website where people can just upload images and it becomes sellable. And these are things that hopefully, after reading my book, which was indeed discussed in Parliament as well as late as February of this year, we hope this will put an end and also come up with a very strong legislation and a central art crime squad, not only to fight the return of thousands of stolen objects, but also bring the network down. One such network we have named in the book is still active. He goes by the code name Shanto, and he is still unarrested. Hopefully, he will be booked soon. Thank you.